Liars, lunatics, or lazy? That is the question. I produced a book called Let There Be Gaslight. And this book was two things: an apologetic for why I left the Christian faith, and it was also an apology to those that I believe I've misled for decades. Since self publishing that book, a number of apologists, would be apologists, have lined up to critique the book and critique me, to suspect my motives and my method. And many of them put together by one man, Vocab Malone, who says he got a slew of people, about 10 people he put together and had them all dissect the book. He doled out chapters to people. And so people spoke on different chapters. And as I listened to some of them, I got the sense that they hadn't even really read the book. They just read their chapter, or at least they only focused on their chapter. And that was obvious as I began to listen to their critiques. I'm like, wait, there are things in chapter 2 and chapter 3 that speak to what you're saying about chapter 6. But if you don't take that into account, then your critique of chapter 6 is almost like meaningless. It was a little weird to do it that way. And when I asked Vocab Malone, he actually said that's.
Did y'all like divide it up? Like, hey, you read this chapter, you read this chapter.
That's what I did. Yeah.
Okay. It shows.
So we got two guys. First, we're going to talk about BK Apologists, and then we got Apologists and discredit. So they took to review the book, and as I was watching their review, at certain points I kept saying to myself, like, damn, why does it seem like they haven't read the book? They definitely read the chapter that they're talking about, but why would you say that if you read the book? Why would you? And then, towards the end, they actually said.
So yeah, guys, so we just covered a little bit of 7 and a lot more of chapter 8 of the book.
It seems like you didn't just only cover chapter 8 and some of chapter 7. Seems like that's all you read. Like, I couldn't imagine showing up a half hour late for a movie, staying for 15 minutes, or like getting 10 friends to say, hey, you take 15 minutes, you take 15 minutes, and then we'll all do a movie review only talking about the 15 minutes that we saw. That's a little weird to me. Just know that if you do that, you're probably going to take some things out of context. A lot of things. And way out of context. And you're probably going to assume that the author is doing something he's not doing, saying something he's not saying. And you might even charge him with, he doesn't even do this. Come to find out, he did it before you got there or after you left. These two particular BK Apologists and discredit, what they do is weird because they keep saying that I don't do something. I don't cover something in my book, and then I'm being disingenuous, and really I'm being dishonest. I'm trying to trick people. And it's like, wait, if you read my whole book, you wouldn't be saying this. And so just so you know, I teach as a professor, right? One of the first things I do in my class on the very first day is I give the students a primer in reading comprehension, because I know a lot of people don't read to comprehend. They read to complete an assignment. So I'll tell students like, hey, look, just, I'm going to assign you these chapters. Don't just look for keywords. So I'll give them an example. Let's say the question is, why does the author believe black on black crime exists? If you read the question and you just go looking for the subject, where does he talk about black on black crime? You might find a section that talks about black on black crime. And the section might say, some people believe da 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 da. You're like, oh, okay, that's the answer. But if you would have kept reading, you would see that the author is not saying that. The author is just simply saying, here's what people say. Then 2 paragraphs later, the author might say, but I say da da da. I say all that to say, these apologists are quick to charge me with taking people out of context or putting words in people's mouths. Yet it's clear that that's exactly what they're doing to me. This is the kind of academic I am. I don't just quote people. I don't just find a sentence like, ooh, he said what? I can use that. Before I quote anybody, even if I love the quote, I don't just read the paragraph that the sentence is in. I don't just read the chapter that the sentence is in. I read the entire book that the sentence is in, just so I don't run the risk of somebody 5 years from now saying, remember when you quoted so-and-so? You took them out of context. You're not going to catch me like that. Here's how deep it is for me. I don't just read the book that the quote is in. I find other books written later from the same author because the author might have changed his mind. And I don't want somebody coming to me saying, hey, remember when you said so-and-so said such and such? But 5 years later, he said something different. So why are you saying he still believed that? So there's no way I'm going to take that kind of care before I quote someone and then have you come to me and tell me I took somebody out of context. Meanwhile, you're doing to me the thing that you're saying I'm doing to someone else. And I'm just going to say this too. There's a bunch of people reviewing me. Vocab got like 10 people already. Like, yo, you take this chapter, you take this chapter.
And I think that BK Apologist and Chris do a great job.
So they misrepresent me tremendously. If this is his standard for what doing a great job of critiquing my book is, that tells me everything that I need to know about Vocab Malone's opinion and his process, his thought process. That being said, I don't think I'm going to be doing a bunch of these. Like, I'm not going to be responding to every video, especially if it's of this quality where people are not taking the time to understand what I'm saying. Why would I take the time to watch a review and respond to it?
So we're going to start off with these two, BK Apologist and Apologist Indictrine. And I hope I'm pronouncing their names right, because the last thing you would want to do is review somebody's work and then mispronounce their name, especially if their name is like right on the thing that you're reviewing.
Mr. Godwin.
It's not Godwin. I actually like this dude. I don't know him. I've never met these guys. At least I don't think I met them. But he actually says some things that I really appreciate. And as we get further into this review, what you're going to see is he actually has landed in several places that I suggest in my book. Yo, this is actually a good place to land. And he would know that if he read the book. And if they did read the book and still went on to say the things that we're about to get into, he actually begins, though, by making a very helpful distinction. But if you pay attention, the distinction actually leads to some issues.
Like, there is a gap, there is a notable gap between the academy and the church. I would classify the church as where it takes what comes out of the academy and turns them into streams of traditions. You know, you can be a Reformed tradition, you could be a non-Reformed, you could be Baptist, Anabaptist. There's a bunch of different aspects of theology that begin to, congregate people around them and form into traditions. And while that's happening at the academic level, there are more people studying more, transcribing more scripts, learning more about the ancient world where these scripts came from. There are elements of their work that change the way that we understand the Bible. But on Sunday mornings, that's not how it's communicated to you as a tradition. It's communicated to you as truth, because each tradition considers their belief system a truthful or accurate representation of scriptures, and they just think that others are mistaken on minor things that really don't, make a big difference in practicing these religions. The conflation of truth and tradition, every tradition calling their belief system truth, as combined with this reality of this gap between the academy, some of which he alludes to some of the things that the academy are come from the academy that haven't quite trickled into that understanding, quite trickled into the traditions yet, does make it seem like if you're not aware of that, if you discovered that, I can see how that would disturb a person.
I don't know if you caught what he was trying to throw there. He made this distinction between tradition and truth. The problem, however, is how do you determine what's tradition and what's truth? What if what you've been calling truth all this time has just been tradition? Who gets to decide what's tradition and what's truth?
because some of it is a little bit uniquely different from our traditions, and it will give you pause. That said, the reality is, the majority of those scholars, and majority might be too strong of a word. I'll say a significant number of them, enough to where it's not it's not of any major concern.
To who? Isn't that subjective?
Maintain their belief in God, belief in Jesus Christ. They maintain their commitment to the Christian faith.
I don't need any number of people to tell me what I should believe. All I need is for someone trustworthy to confirm that these are real issues. Once I understand that, I can figure out on my own if I want to continue believing.
They maintain their commitment to the Christian faith, and I think that is because they recognize that their little piece of the puzzle does not change the fundamental message of the scripture, and therefore they maintain it. And so, on the other hand, I feel like, what makes you, Mr. Godwin, any smarter, any better than these guys who actually speak the original language, who actually understand these things much better than all of us, because that's part of their discipline and their discipline. What makes you so smart that you're able to not only look at the small pieces like each of them do, but actually run the whole scope of scripture and be dismissive? I just think that's incredibly arrogant.
It's not really a matter of me being smart enough. It's a matter of me not being willing to violate my conscience. And if you're appealing to the number of scholars who know the original language and believe a certain thing, you've got to know that there are other scholars who also know the languages and don't believe. I don't really see what point you're proving. That can't be what helps us decide the issue here.
It really irritated me because he kind of revealed the reason why he thought that the scriptures aren't meritorious. And to me, it's like, bruh, that's your tradition.
He says, it's my tradition. That's Fanatics' tradition. That's Brady's tradition. He just needs to come out of his tradition. Come out of my tradition into what? What are you suggesting that people like me come out of our 1800-year tradition into what? And what makes what you're about to say truth and not just a different tradition?
Like everybody don't see it that way.
Right.
You really got beef with your tradition and not necessarily the authentic Christianity. And if that's the case, then you could have just switched traditions. And I think that he's smart enough to know that, because he mentioned it. He said he claimed in one of his videos that he didn't want to be a liberal Christian. The word liberal gets thrown around an awful lot. It really is subjective.
They say they've read the book, but they don't seem to understand that the kind of liberal Christian I would have had to become in order to take into account all of the issues that were causing me to doubt, that it would have completely undone the historic Christian faith. Not just my tradition, the tradition. I know Christians, or should I say, I know people who are still trying to hold their Christian faith intact while at the same time accepting all of what science has to say and the issues with the text when it comes to ancient Near Eastern studies. That is not historic Christian faith. This host wants people watching to know that if they're troubled by any of the issues that I bring up, or that even he brings up, that they can just liberalize. They don't have to leave the faith. But I bring this point up in the book. That was not an option for me. That felt dishonest. I can't bring myself to talk about these ancient ideas as if the writers had some insight into metaphysical realities that I don't believe they had.
And I thought that that would be helpful for us, because if some of our audience, if they aren't aware of these things, they might have a very similar journey. Or if they read his book, they might think that it's making a much stronger case than really what it is.
Right.
It might be that the faith is getting ready to morph into something much more elastic. That's fine. All I'm saying is, I don't need that. It demonstrates to me that what this belief system is not truth. It is entirely traditions that are subject to change, primarily because they were not given to us by a divine mind, but by the minds of ancient men who did not know what we know now, and therefore their truth must change. And I endeavor to lay that out in the book. When you start writing academically, one of the things you have to do is keep your readers, or make your readers abreast of how wide is this conversation? What are the issues that need to be covered? Who else has spoken on these issues? What have they said? What's the history of this conversation? And what are the current events that are making people change their views about this conversation? It's not just that ancient Near Eastern literature is being understood better now. There's that. But then there's also scientific developments, specifically with evidence for evolution. If that's not part of what you're talking about in this discussion, what you're saying doesn't even really matter at this point, because that's where the conversation has gotten to. For instance, many Christians may not even know or are just becoming aware that the world-renowned apologist William Lane Craig has gone through a similar, I don't know if he would call it crisis of faith, but an internal battle trying to reconcile his faith about what he believes is happening in the heavens with the reality of the facts from the ground as new evidence comes to light.
And in his paper, Bill Arnold presented this view of the genre of Genesis 1 to 11 as a mytho-history. And that was the first time I had ever heard this labeled or discussed. And it really lit a fire under me. I mean, you were the scientific fire that was lit beneath me, but Bill Arnold's genre analysis was the biblical or interpretive fire that was lit under me, and that I then began to explore.
You've said several times that this has been like a very stressful, difficult.
Right.
I'm having a blast. Why aren't you having fun with me?
I don't know. I guess I think it's just too weighty. And
yeah, but what's at risk, though, Bill?
Okay, that's a good question, Josh. I have to ask myself that question. I've always sort of taken this to be a peripheral, trivial issue, not part of what is called mere Christianity. I mean, what belongs to mere Christianity are things like the existence of God, the deity of Christ, his atoning death, his resurrection. If you affirm those, who cares about the historical Adam, right? Well, the problem is, although we've talked today all about Genesis and its view of Adam and Eve, you've got this New Testament material on Adam and Eve that cannot be ignored. What's at stake is the infallibility and inerrancy of the New Testament.
We knew this 2 years ago, though, Bill.
Well,
didn't you realize 2 years ago that it was going to work out?
Well, I suppose I had a sort of rough idea, but no, I've really struggled with this and wrestled with this. The most difficult part of this whole question is not the Old Testament material. It's the New Testament material. It's the statements of Jesus himself about Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, and this primeval history where Jesus seems, to all appearances, to believe in the historicity of these events. So if you say that, well, these are not historical persons and not historical events, that means that Jesus held false beliefs. And that is incompatible with his omniscience, because to be omniscient is to believe all truths and to hold no false beliefs. And that is incompatible with his deity. So as crazy as it sounds, I think what's at stake is the deity of Christ.
And in my book, I talk about how Craig reconciles these issues, and I analyze the strengths and weaknesses of doing it in the way that Craig and others put forth in their recent works. Once you take that into account, you realize that you can't have this conversation without talking about the history of the literal interpretation of Genesis and why the literal interpretation is called the traditional view. Because there's a huge problem, even without science, between what Paul says in Romans 5 and the way you have to interpret ancient Near Eastern literature. Then when you add the science on top of that, it complicates things even more. So if you're not taking my book from beginning to end, you're really disjointing the whole conversation. You're responding to a section of the book, but you're not responding to my argument, which is not fair. So all of this is what's going through my mind as I'm watching these people review my book or the section of the book that they read. Let's get into what it is that they find in my book that they feel like is unscholarly or disingenuous. They didn't have anything positive to say about my book at all, which is very interesting to me.
The question of which God created the heavens and the earth sounds strange to Christian ears. Even to the ears of those who practice Judaism, this is an offensive inquiry. Most people who know anything about Israel know that they were a monotheistic people. Most think of polytheism as something forbidden that kept creeping into Israel's Yahweh-only world from outside of its religious center. But suppose it is the reverse. What if it is monotheism that slowly crept into a polytheistic Israel? What if the story of Israel turning away from the one true God who birthed her is nothing but revisionist history, i.e., a much later socially, politically motivated spin on what really happened in the past? And what if the evidence of this has been sitting right there in the biblical text all this time?
Well, let's see the evidence. And this is from African Indigenous Religion and its Ancient Model Reflections of Congo Hierarchical Monotheism from the Journal of Black Studies. It says, Western monotheism was taken as the apothegm of religion, to which the Black man was believed to have never had access. It was placed at the first stage of the evolution of religion, opined to be fetishism and animism. Western theism was the yardstick with which every religion of the world was measured and found wanting. This is what Chris is saying about this Western imperialism ideology that Mr. Brady seems to be conveying here. The privileged position of Western theism began to waver when W. Schmidt argued that monotheism, not fetishism or animism, is the first stage of religion.
So think about this. This person is talking about monotheism versus fetishism or animism, not monotheism versus polytheism. Okay.
And in the book, In the Beginning God, a fresh look at the case for original monotheism, Schmidt's factual investigations led him to conclude that the oldest groups of people always had a notion of a high God and often expressed very little animistic thinking. Therefore, animism could not have been original or first, but had to be later. So the thing that he's wondering about, that maybe it's reversed, maybe it's like, well, he's completely wrong, because the anthropologists here completely disagree with you.
You're quoting someone who themselves is talking about the oldest people. Israel is nowhere near the oldest people group, first of all. Second of all, this person himself says these oldest groups often, and then he questions often enough to be always. He doesn't know. How does that refute what I'm saying about ancient Israel that is nowhere near the oldest people group? Yet for him, that concludes the matter because he can simply say,
so you're wrong. All ancient people had a monotheistic framework. It was much later on that polytheism crept in.
In fact, you only bring up one of the passages that I point to that demonstrate ancient Israel had polytheistic roots. But I'm wrong.
All right, here's another portion of the book. This is where
he's laughing, but this is actually laughable what you're doing. Carry on.
This is where it gets real interesting. So again, Chris.
Yeah. These are uncomfortable facts for Bible translators, and footnotes acknowledging it appear only in some study Bibles. Many Christian theologians attempting to explain the plural nature of Elohim offer that the Hebrew Bible, it represents a plural or majesty used because of the manifold greatness of God. Others allege that here, at the earliest stage of Revelation, we are being told of the Trinity. Most scholars reject that the concept of the Trinity could have been anywhere in the human author's mind. Still, even some of these think God was likely preparing the way to progressively reveal his triune nature at a later stage of the redemptive history. Meanwhile, Old Testament scholars like Michael Heiser and W. Randall Garr refer to the above explanations as interpretive sleight of hand, i.e., somewhat deceptive ploy. Our belief is further challenged by the fact that the plural name of the Canaanite deities appear in conjunction with both singular and plural pronouns in Genesis. Observe the chapter 1, verse 16 that uses the third person singular pronoun, and verse 27 uses the third person singular possessives, his, when referring to God, Elohim. Yet, when God speaks in verse 26, the text reads, God, Elohim, said, let us make men in our image and in our likeness. The verb said is in the third person masculine singular tense. But why is it accompanied by the third person plural us and our? Of course, the commentaries have an answer for this too. This is the plural of self-address, such as when I have been lying in a bed for too long, I might say to myself, come on, let's get up. But is this just more theological trickery?
Right. So, yes, there are theologians like Heiser who believe that, you know, the group that's surrounding God in Genesis 1 is not the Trinity, right? Now, he also affirms the Trinity. Heiser is actually very orthodox and conservative. He's not a liberal scholar at all. Some of us do believe that it was the council and not the Trinity. Not that the Trinity doesn't exist. In fact, if God's there, and we know God is triune, the Trinity is already there, right? But is that what the text is trying to say? Now, he quotes Heiser in that particular quote, right?
So now they want to take issue with me quoting evangelical scholar Michael Heiser. The sad thing, though, is they're going to lie about me using Michael Heiser to amen a point that I make that Heiser doesn't agree with.
I just happen to have this paper as well. Let's see what else Heiser says, because what he's trying to infer by using Heiser is that there was a gathering of gods who created the world. And he's using Heiser as if Heiser agrees with this. Let's see if he does in the same paper that he has. All right, Chris?
With Garr and many others, of course, I'd agree that Genesis 1:26 and Genesis 11:7 are God speaking to members of the divine council, the heavenly host. God is announcing his intentions to persuasively elicit a positive response. When it comes to the creation act, Genesis 1:27, and the dispersion at Babel, Genesis 11:8 and 9, the grammar is equally clear that only God is actor. The verb,
say that last part?
Only God is actor.
Uh-huh.
The verb forms and pronouns switch back to singular.
They have extremely misrepresented my point here. I did not recruit Michael Heiser to say he supports my view that more gods than just one is involved in creation. I only recruited Michael Heiser to show that I am not alone in thinking that there are other divine beings in Genesis 1. In fact, Michael Heiser challenges other evangelicals to basically stop playing games with Genesis 1. Stop trying to say it's the Trinity when God says, let us make man in our image, and stop doing all these other things, because for Heiser, he clearly sees what he calls the divine council in Genesis 1. Other beings, other divine beings. Now, Heiser has some nuances to who he thinks these divine beings are, but other beings around the throne who God is speaking to when he says, let us make man in our image. Here's how you know that I'm not saying that Heiser thinks that these are other gods who are responsible for creation. Because I go on to challenge Michael Heiser saying, you think these other evangelicals are playing games. I think you're using theological trickery when you acknowledge that there are other beings around the throne, but you're trying to downplay the role that they had in creation. But I don't think Heiser is going far enough, because I think those other divine beings in this text, the way the text is written, the other divine beings did have a role in the creation of the heavens and the earth and man in our image.
So this is the same paper that he's quoting from to try to convey his argument here, his point. Now whether or not believers, we differ in, well, is it the divine council or is it the Trinity? I mean, by default, it is the Trinity because God is there, right? But that's not the issue. The issue is who's doing the creating. Forget divine council, Trinity. Who's doing the creating here?
And let me make it clear, because I do think that there's a little bit of I do think this is a little complicated. So Brady is saying that, ancient Near Eastern creation origins, where creation happened through a pantheon of gods.
Right.
And he's saying that the Israelite story is saying that it's a pantheon of gods also, and that monotheism was a later revision. That's what he's saying. And what this is showing is that the scholar, the actual Old Testament Hebrew scholar, is saying no, because it has this plural Elohim in there, does not mean that the plural is what created everything. If you watch the grammar closely, the grammar is implying that Yahweh alone did the creating, and he mentions the plural. He mentions whether that's the rest of the Trinity or the divine council, whatever it is, he mentions it as to get this affirmative response. And if you really think about it in the concept of the Old Testament posits Yahweh as the king of the gods. So it's like a king holding court, and which would fit with either one of them. And while holding this court, he says something to the congregation to get an amen.
Again, this does not, it cannot solve the issue. I grant that is an interesting way to try to parse out this problem in the text. But this is one scholar's approach to a problematic passage. There are as many approaches to this problem as there are scholars. And there are a good deal of Old Testament Hebrew language scholars who would say that the Elohim in chapter 1 of Genesis is an echo of an older myth, an echo of an older polytheistic myth that has stuck around in the text. And I quote several of them in this chapter. And I'm inclined to believe them because there is a plethora of evidence for the residue of polytheism that is latent in the Old Testament text.
But the very scholar that he's quoting from in this paper disagrees with him.
No, he agrees with me about the thing that I recruited him for, to demonstrate that the us in our image is more than just one being. Who those beings are and what those beings actually do is something that Heiser and I disagree on. That's plain in the book, if you read for comprehension.
So he's being disingenuous. He read this part, saw that it undercuts his argument, and kept it moving.
No, sir, that's not what I'm doing. You misunderstood why I was quoting Heiser. I charge him with the same theological trickery that he accuses other evangelicals of.
Chris, please.
So what's the point of the plural singular juxtaposition? It shows that somehow humanity, God, and the members of the heavenly host, divine council, are linked. We share something. That something is explained by the concept of imaging God. The image is a statue, not a quality given to humans. We image God on earth like the members of the council image him in the spiritual world. We are all representatives of the singular creator.
Of the single creator. Heiser is affirming that it is God and God alone who created everything. This undercuts what he's trying to say, even though he's quoting this very paper, though.
In summarizing Heiser's position, I note, those in Yahweh's divine council are spirit beings whom he rules over, not with. He simply allows them to share in his authority. So then, even though Genesis 1 only mentions the Elohim and does not mention Yahweh whatsoever, what's really happening, according to Heiser, is that Yahweh is talking to the spirit beings that he, A, does not need, yet B, invites to delight in his decisions and actions. It is because these beings will rule over mankind for Yahweh that Yahweh can say to them, "Let us make man in our image." Image, Heiser argues, is not a quality, but a status shared by humans and the divine council. And while I do not agree with Heiser's creative solutions to these problems in the text, I go on to summarize his position, stating that Michael Heiser agrees with Hebrew and Ugaritic scholars that the biblical writers drew upon El and Baal epithets and motifs when describing Yahweh. The strategy of identifying Yahweh with these two major rival deities reinforced the agenda of monotheism by attributing the status and powers of El and Baal to Yahweh. In the Ugaritic Divine Council, El was supreme on the highest level, while Baal was beneath him, yet still divine. Heiser argues that Israel copied this structure, but because they were monotheistic, they put Yahweh on both levels, invisible and transcendent at the El level, while manifest and tangible as the angel of the Lord at the Baal level. However, Heiser is quick to clarify that this was not polytheism, for both were one and the same deity, what he calls two Yahweh co-regency. These two Yahwehs make up Israel's divine council and serve as a polemic against Canaan's. But is Heiser here resorting to the same theological trickery that he detests in others? Now, I'm not sure if he agrees with Heiser, but B.K. Apologist goes on to quote from Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm.
He unpacks a little bit more here in his book, The Unseen Realm. It says the solution is more straightforward, one that an ancient Israelite would have readily discerned. What we have is a single person, God, addressing a group, the members of his divine council. It's like me going into a room of friends and saying, hey, let's go get some pizza. I'm the one speaking. A group is hearing what I say. Similarly, God comes to the divine council with an exciting announcement. Let's create humankind. But if God is speaking to his divine council here, does that suggest that humankind was created by more than one Elohim? Was the creation of humankind a group project? Not at all. Back to my pizza illustration. If I am the one paying for the pizza, making the plan happen after announcing it, then I retain both the inspiration and the initiative of the entire project. That's how Genesis 1:26 works.
But it's a poor analogy. Let us make man in our image is a bizarre thing to say to divine beings who will have no involvement in the action. If I said, let's go get some pizza and put it in our belly, but then only I go to the store and only I get pizza and it only goes in my belly, was the group's only participation in delighting in me making this decision? Why am I speaking to the group? And what kind of a friend says, hey, let's go get pizza, but then only they eat it? And here's something else that stands out to me. You're quoting from a scholar when you have all these different Christian scholars who disagree on what these things mean. How does any of that convey that the tradition that you hold is a consistent one that's worthy of my belief?
So he's affirming that God is the singular creator, and he's just announcing to his crew that he rocks out with in the heavens, the council, hey guys, look what we're going to do. But he's the one that does it, though. And we see the tense is changing, you know? So, yeah, listen, to see Road Warrior, I understand.
Awkward. The third person whose chat message just appeared on the screen during this live recording is another would-be apologist, but one with a super wooden literal interpretation of Genesis that will not allow him to agree with Michael Heiser or these two hosts. B.K. Apologists will attempt to downplay this difference as a non-salvific issue. But my question is, if this passage is meant to elicit my worship for the God of creation, don't I need to know whether I am dealing with a God or gods? And what do I do if, in my attempt to get truth from this passage, I keep getting the sense that this is nothing but ancient mythology being reworked by little less ancient people?
You know, a lot of believers don't agree with the divine council argument, and that's fine. This is not a salvific issue. But what's the point that's being made here? God created everything. Divine council or not, it's still God. If it's the triune God that he's talking to himself, it's still God. Either way you slice it, God is the creator. It's not God's plural. And that's the point here that Heiser is making, that Brady doesn't seem to want to admit to, even though he has the paper that he quotes from.
And I would, I would say, with C Road Warrior, this is a great illustration of traditions. You participate in a tradition that see things differently, and you think that your way is correct. So the problem would come if you present your tradition as though it's truth.
If we don't have access to truth, then what the hell are we talking about? Is mytho-history history, or just myth pretending to be history? And how do we know?
And say that everything else that disagrees with that is false. I think that's where the conflict comes in. And if that's his tradition, that's his tradition. That doesn't make him a non-Christian for something like that.
But everyone's tradition, regardless of where they are, we all agree, and we have to agree on this point, that God alone created everything.
But isn't it the case that you're only saying that we have to agree because that is your tradition? What makes your tradition truth?
The point that's being made by Heiser is that God alone does the creating. And I think we all agree with that, amen? In fact, we all better agree to that.
Exactly.
Right?
It is now the dumbest thing in the world to me to say we all better agree when we're dealing with unverifiable truth claims. I prefer to say that it is in our best interest to verify the things that we think are true. Until then, skepticism is warranted, and we should reserve judgment.
So, but again, he's being disingenuous by quoting a paper from Heiser to try to infer that Heiser agrees with him, when in fact, when you look at the paper itself, he disagrees with it.
Again, this accusation comes from your inattention to detail, your inability to comprehend, or your unwillingness to be honest.
And whatever you would want to say about this particular passage, there are other passages in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, that demonstrate that Yahweh was not the only God in Israel's mindset. And Yahweh had to become Israel's main God by taking over the role that other gods used to play. If you're interested in this, I compile these ideas with support in the book.
This is another part of the book that we're going to deal with. Yeah.
This understanding of origins comes from interpreting Genesis 1:1 as an event where all matter in the universe miraculously came into being without the use of any pre-existent material. But is that what the text actually saying or even means to say? In other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, the gods do not create ex nihilo. So if that is what Genesis is presenting, then the Israelite account is indeed unique. But the reality is that the Bible is not different in this regard. In all these stories, at least two things exist at the beginning: a God or gods and a watery chaos, the primordial seas. We don't see this clearly in our Bibles because of the way the Hebrew text has been pointed and punctuated, and because of the way the tradition of Genesis 1:1 has been altered and passed down.
He's saying this because, again, there is a difference of opinion between theologians about whether or not Genesis 1:1 should be rendered as a dependent or independent clause, right? Because if you render it as a dependent clause, then it seems as it's God dealing with pre-existed matter, right? And of course, he quotes Heiser again for that.
I don't know what he's talking about here. They've moved on to chapter 8 now. These are all the different scholars that I quote in this particular chapter. Heiser, checking. No.
Here's the thing. Heiser is not saying that.
I don't mention Michael Heiser's name at all in this chapter. I don't rely on Heiser to make any of these points.
Wenham comments that the original mythology,
not original mythology, Oriental mythology,
creation has to do with the organizing chaos when the origin of that chaos is left undiscussed. In fact, it might be presumed to be eternal. If that is the case, then it is truly amazing that Israel's origin story only had one pre-existing God and no pre-existing material. Doesn't this validate its divine inspiration? But we have already seen that Genesis 1 in its earliest form likely had more than one God. Is it therefore so hard to believe that it also began with the pre-existing, uncreated material as well?
Cool. So, and for the record, Heiser does believe in ex nihilo as well.
Heiser, checking. No.
He believes in all, he believes in all the essentials.
What I demonstrate in this chapter is how the idea of creation ex nihilo in Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, came into ancient Israel's thinking from outside. On this particular topic, one of the books that I had to read back in Bible college 20 years ago from a very well-known and respected Old Testament scholar, he has since then published different views on this particular issue. This is not to say that the scholars who are changing their views on this no longer believe in creation ex nihilo. They do. They just don't go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 anymore. I deal with that in the book as well. In this chapter, I discuss how evangelical Old Testament scholars Bill T. Arnold and C. John Collins deal with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 as it relates to creation ex nihilo. It was Arnold who introduced apologist William Lane Craig to the concept of early Genesis as mythohistory, and Arnold who used to see Genesis 1:1 as teaching creation ex nihilo. He no longer holds this view. But hope is not lost for the concept. It simply is found elsewhere. For instance, as I note in this chapter, C. John Collins appeals to the apocryphal book 2nd Maccabees and the New Testament book of Hebrews. However, it is strange that Collins would use these later passages to interpret the earlier one. In the very same commentary, he advocates that we should strive to read Genesis the way a competent reader in the original audience would have. But the Apocrypha was written around 150 before Common Era, and the book of Hebrews around the year 64 in the Common Era. Collins says that he is not reading the New Testament back into the Old Testament. He claims that these later authors shared the worldview of the author of Genesis, but this is doubtful for reasons that I get into later in the chapter. The two would-be apologists in this video do likewise.
But of course, we know that God's relatory exercise doesn't begin and end in Genesis 1. We continue to hear about God's creative ability throughout Scripture. So let's look at a couple of these scriptures. Hebrews 11:3.
By faith, we understand that the universe, the cosmos, was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible.
Colossians 1:16.
For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible.
Revelations 4:11.
Worthy are you, our Lord and God, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created.
So these things existed because of God's will. That's ex nihilo.
Really? Colossians? Revelation? What does that have to do with what the author of Genesis 1 was communicating? Going outside of Genesis to get this idea is helpful if you're trying to arrive at a systematic theology, not if you're trying to understand this actual passage in Genesis chapter 1. Of course, if you believe there's one divine author, then you're going to be able to smooth all this out. I'm not under that persuasion.
And I would say also, like, I don't like his point about Genesis 1 and 1 not saying, or Genesis chapter 1 not saying that God created it out of nothing, that theologians imported this notion to it. And I would say that's true.
Interesting. Go on.
It doesn't say that in Genesis chapter 1. It does say it within the scope of Scripture, though.
This is what I was saying. that did not become the understanding of this passage until after the 3rd century BCE.
There's a book, it's In the Beginning We Misunderstood. And it points out that literally everything that's referenced in Genesis chapter 1 is an Egyptian god. The sky, the birds, the...
Now, here's why I think they didn't really read the book. I quote from that book, In the Beginning We Misunderstood, extensively. Not only do I quote from it, but I reveal that one of the authors is a professor at a Bible college that I used to teach at before I quit. Not only was he a coworker of mine, he was a professor at the school 20 years ago when I was a student there. And I asked this professor, if I had taken his class 20 years ago, would I have heard the things in his class that I'm now reading in this book? And he told me, no, his views have actually shifted. Now, that's not to say that he agrees with me on most of what I'm saying in my book. But this professor also admitted to me that he was not up on the latest scientific evidence for evolution and would have to think about how those concerns actually impact our understanding of Genesis.
But again, right, the concept of ex nihilo is not some invention that we hundreds of years later decided to retrofit it back into scripture.
Dude, you went to Colossians and Revelation. That's hundreds of years after Genesis was written. My point is that Genesis 1:1 begins with pre-existing, uncreated material. As several of the Old Testament scholars mentioned in this chapter have always maintained or have recently changed their views to be able to allow.
Regardless of whether it be Moses or a later editor, the question is raised: does it destroy the notion of divine inspiration? If much of the origin stories in the Hebrew Bible reflect the type of borrowing from older myths, not necessarily. It could be, as some argue, that God simply wrapped his truths in these cultural stories, in which case it becomes our job to sift through and filter out the timeless truths from the outdated cultural vehicles used to deliver them. Divine revelation then would be found in the differences between Israel's account and her neighbors. That is the common response from those who take the polemical approach. However, here we will focus not on the distinctions, but the similarities.
Right. And he shows his hand right here. Okay. So when he wants to talk about the creation account, he's not going to take into account the differences, but only the similarities. That's very problematic, because what he's going to do when he conveys his argument is he's going to jettison all the data that the ancient Israelites had at their disposal, right? Because the book of Genesis 1, is written in such a manner that they could understand based on what they knew. He's not going to share with us what they understood of their neighborhood, of their region. And he does that on purpose, because if he was to talk about the differences, it would be very problematic for his argument.
I don't say we're not going to focus on the differences. What I say is here, meaning in this chapter, we're going to focus on the similarities, because elsewhere I focus on the differences, such as in chapter 6. As a matter of fact, I give an entire breakdown of the polemic approach in that chapter. Many commentators have drawn attention to the fact that the Hebrew Bible is not the only, or first, ancient document to give a rendition of the world's creation. Not only does the Old Testament community have this in common with their neighbors, but there are also an astonishing number of similarities between the stories told across several cultures. Seeing early Genesis as a polemic, what matters is not the similarities between Israel's version and their neighbors, but rather the differences. The areas of disagreement are where the divine revelation is found. For instance, even though Israel and its neighbors all have flood stories, the Mesopotamian god Enlil destroys mankind for making too much noise. Enlil is wrong and regrets his decision. But for Israel, God destroys mankind because they became too evil. God regrets making them in the first place, and he is righteous for his judgment. For non-literalists,
The theological gem is mainly in the differences. After discussing the ways that literalists and non-literalists approach early Genesis as a polemic, I continue, this is why non-literalists maintain that the Hebrew Bible is simply, polemically retelling the tales of their neighbors and former captives, but with a Yahwistic twist. They say, we interpret the Bible incorrectly when we assume that it means to convey a literal six-day creation, flood, and possibly even the garden narrative. But, they add, literal and historical are not the same thing. Genesis can be historical without being literal. And I go on to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of this approach.
And again, he doesn't want to bring up this understanding that they had.
As a result, we are not looking at ancient literature to try to decide whether Israel borrowed from some of the literature that was known to them. It is to be expected that the Israelites held many concepts and perspectives in common with the rest of the ancient world. This is far different from suggesting literature was borrowed or copied. This is not even a case of Israel being influenced by the peoples around them. Rather, we simply recognize the common conceptual worldview that existed in ancient times. We should therefore not speak of Israel being influenced by the world. They were part of that world.
You know what I mean? So it's like, I'm not, so, and that's a little side thing for those who like to say that, you know, the Bible is plagiarizing from these other cultures. No, it's part of that culture.
That sounds familiar. I wonder if I say anything similar. Experts in the field of ancient Near Eastern studies would caution us against looking down upon the practice of one culture borrowing and reusing narratives from another. In fact, they'd say we don't even really understand accounts like Genesis until we learn how these stories were shared and reshaped by neighboring peoples. Quoting Assyriologist Dr. Joshua Bowen, I state, the authors of the Hebrew Bible in Genesis 6 through 9, for instance, were very clearly using the flood stories of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. It's not that they're plagiarizing. It's not a lazy pulling and copying from another culture's story. They're actually being incredibly creative, using the shared music of popular myths to write their own theological responses to the ideology of the surrounding nations.
To compare the Old Testament to the literature of the ancient world is not to assume that we expect or find similarity at every point, but neither should we assume or expect differences at every point. We believe the nature of the Bible to be very different from anything else that was available in the ancient world. The very fact that we accept the Old Testament as God's revelation of himself distinguishes it from the literature of Mesopotamia or Egypt. For that matter, Egyptian literature was very different from Mesopotamian literature, and within Mesopotamia, the Assyrian literature and Babylonian literature were far from homogeneous.
And again, this makes his argument lacking because by him only focusing on the similarities, look how much data he has to throw away in order for him to make his argument. Because outside of the Bible, the other cultures in the ancient Near East are not similar. They have their own differences, but he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to deal with the differences between Mesopotamian and Assyrian. He don't want to deal with the different millennium versions of Babylonian literature. He doesn't want to deal with none of this because if he does, it undercuts his argument.
Okay, now I'm starting to think he's just trolling. I literally have an entire section where I talk about the way ancient Near Eastern cultures conquered one another, confiscated the literature, and changed the literature to polemically make it reflect their own cultural understandings. And I literally mention the Babylonians, the Mesopotamians, the Assyrians. Yet they charge me with being disingenuous. This attempt at a review would be funny if it wasn't so sad.
He's not going to speak on those references. Let's get into some of these creation stories. Let's look at the differences that Mr. Brady does not want us to really look at for some strange reason.
First, nothing existed except for two personified principles, Apsu and Tiamat, the primeval sweetwater and saltwater oceans, respectively. We find Tiamat reigning unsubdued opposed by and suppressing the gods she has begotten. One of them engages Tiamat in combat and slays her.
Do we see any of this in Genesis 1?
Sounds just like the Bible. Tiamat is completely absent in the notion of Tihom in the Hebrew creation account. In Genesis 1, Tihom is nothing else but a passive, powerless, inanimate element in God's creation.
Dag. I guess I should have included a section on this. Oh, wait. I did. Compare Enuma Elish to Genesis chapter 1, verse 6, where God separates the waters, but there is no chaos, no struggle. So, it is proposed, maybe God's spirit hovering over Tihom is meant as a polemic to show the difference in the Hebrew God's power. The Tihom does not, indeed it cannot misbehave because Israel's God has more authority than does the Babylonians. But this comes after the chapter that they read, so let's see what else they have.
There's no fighting. God is not fighting anyone in Genesis 1.
In the text, he's exercising his sovereign authority over everything.
Absolutely. Amen. Heliopolitan theology in ancient Kemet.
And one of the Egyptian cosmogonic speculations, Atum, whom arose out of the pre-existent Nun, threatened that the land will return into Nun, into the flood.
Stop there. Atum, could he create from pre-existent material? Because he's made of pre-existent material. So water was an actual entity creating these gods. What was water doing again in Genesis 1, Chris?
In the beginning, I can't remember off the top of my head.
Water wasn't doing anything.
It wasn't doing nothing.
It was there.
Yes.
It was inanimate, powerless,
yes,
nothing.
Yes.
It was at the beck and will of Yahweh. So Atum, who's a created being, is the one who creates other gods who are created beings.
If these two reviewers were not so dead set on refuting me, but rather understanding me, they might have realized that I too mentioned the Egyptian god Atum. Specifically, one version of the creation story that has the god Atum creating himself by separating himself from the pre-existent primordial waters by uttering his own name. Atum then goes on to create another god, the dry air, which is then used to separate two other gods, heaven and earth. Regardless of the point these reviewers want me to make about the differences, what mattered most for my point was the similarities, as we'll see in a moment.
Just like Genesis, right?
Just like Genesis.
In Hermopolitan cosmogony, there existed prior to creation an infinite, dark, watery chaos, whose characteristics are incorporated into the four pairs of gods in the Ogadot. As the water begins to stir, the primeval hillock emerges from the deep, bringing up the cosmic egg, out of which Re, the sun god, will appear to proceed with the creation of all other things. Ra, right, Re, powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon, came from an egg.
Just like Genesis.
Just like it. Absolutely, word for word, verbatim.
Do I ever make the claim that early Genesis is just like the creation stories and the cultures that surround ancient Israel? What I say is that Genesis is like the creation stories in the surrounding cultures in certain key aspects. My point was that in this particular chapter, we're going to focus on the similarities between Israel and its neighbors, because even after the polemics, even after the differences, there are certain mythological elements that still remain. Matter of fact, 4 key mythological elements that remain. The first is that in Genesis chapter 1, there is a plurality of divine beings that are responsible for creating the world of mankind and ruling over it. Second, that the beginning is not the beginning of time, but the beginning of the story. Third is that matter is pre-existent in Genesis chapter 1 and not created ex nihilo. And fourth is that the fall in Genesis chapter 3 is not about mankind becoming sinful. Rather, it's about mankind becoming divine competition for the divine beings and therefore losing access to immortality. These are the mythical elements that remain, despite the polemics that Israel might be engaging in to combat the theology of the nations around it.
So in these creation accounts, we see two things happening here. We see a theomachy, which is a term that refers to battles among the gods, particularly in the Babylonian creation epic, Emunah Elish. You also have in many of these creation accounts a theogony, which is a cosmological work describing the origins and genealogy of the gods. Chris, I have a question. In Genesis, do we see a theomachy?
No.
Do we see a theogony?
No.
Does that make a world of difference that we don't see these two things?
It makes a world of difference.
And this is why he didn't want to talk about the differences. We ain't done yet, though. In Egyptian cosmogony, one finds that Shu, the air god, pushed up Nut, the sky goddess, and Geb, the earth god, from whom she was embraced. This forced separation brings about heaven and earth. This picture in Genesis 1:6, has its analogy to pagan mythology, in that it also describes the creation of heaven and earth to be an act of separation. However, notable distinctions appear as soon as one inquires into the how of the act of separation. In contrast to Babylonian and Egyptian mythology, the firmament is raised simply by the fiat of God without any struggle whatever.
Cool story, bro. The Genesis creation narrative had some similarities with other ancient myths, but also some key differences. The question is, don't the mythological similarities reveal that you're not talking about real events in history? And doesn't this now make the differences in your story theological claims, not statements of fact? And if so, why should I or anyone else believe your claims? It's not that I don't understand how polemical statements work. It's because I do understand how they work that I'm now free to ask these questions about what you're claiming is true.
The views of deity in the ancient world served as the context for Israel's understanding of deity. It is true that the God of the Bible is far different from the gods of the ancient cultures, but Israel's understood its God in reference to what others around them believed.
And he has decided in his book to censor those references.
No. I'm drawing attention to the problem with trying to get truth from a polemical claim. Let me explain to you how I see this. If you were to say that your dad lifted the couch with everyone on it, I don't need to believe your claim to counter your claim. Oh yeah? Well, my dad lifted the car with everyone sitting in it. That's a polemical counter. I told a similar story and switched the detail to make the claim that my dad is stronger than your dad. We don't know if either of these claims are true. But there's no reason to disbelieve them because they're both in the realm of possibility. Though you might have some reason to disbelieve my claim because I only told it after you told yours. Now let's change it a little. Suppose you said on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of the weekend at 12:15, 11:70 p.m. a.m., your dad lifted the couch with everyone sitting on it, and everyone on the couch weighed 2 tons each. And while your dad was doing that with one hand, with the other hand, he was making an omelet out of a magic egg. Now that's an extraordinary claim. But suppose, to counter your claim, I said, oh yeah? Well, on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of the weekend, at 12:15, 11:70 a.m. p.m., my dad lifted the car with everyone sitting in it, and everyone in the car weighed 2 tons. And my dad was also making an omelet, but my dad didn't need his hands to lift the car or make the omelet. And he didn't even need a magic egg. He did it all just by speaking it. Now, I still countered your claim with a polemical claim. But now there are reasons to doubt what you're saying and what I'm saying. We know that Tuesday is not on the weekend. We know that clocks don't work that way, so that the time that's given can't be accurate. Now, maybe your dad and my dad are both strong enough to lift a couch and a car with those weighty people on it. But the idea of a magic egg strains credulity for your claim. And the difference of my dad doing it without either of his hands does make my dad seem all the more powerful. But the fact that my story has so many identical details as your story, it sort of does call into question whether or not I'm telling the truth about any of it. It's not the differences, it's the similarities of my claim to your claim that calls my claim into question. This is why I focus on the similarities in Genesis and not the differences in this particular chapter. The things that the scripture says God does, we know those things did not happen. Is the sky, or was the sky, ever a hard dome separating waters above from waters below? Is that what God did at creation? So clearly, if that's not what happened, we're not talking about literal truth, which is fine. My point is, this allows us to then question, since we're not dealing with actual history, how do we verify that any of it ever happened, that any of it is true? And this goes for the entire creation account.
And this is why, ladies and gentlemen, he didn't want to talk about the differences.
They keep saying this, but now you see that I do address the differences, but that's not what matters.
One of the things that struck me, it was that, and matter of fact, I was talking to Matthew Jackson yesterday, and he was the one that referenced this. I think he said he referenced the actual terminology. I was already going to talk about the concept, but when he referenced the terminology, I was like, I like that terminology. and it's a Western imperialist way of looking at scripture. And what that means is this. Okay, so we are considered Western culture today, all of us who are living here today. And there's certain things about our culture that we are so immersed in that when we talk about them, we don't have to explain them because, you know, it's a part of our culture. Now, a foreigner might come into our culture, come into our neighborhood and communicate with us, and we might have to break it down and explain it to them because they aren't from here. The problem would be is if we standardize our culture and assume that every other culture throughout the entire world had to be compared and contrast with our culture as if our culture was the truth or of all culture and all other culture was some distortion or something that needed to be contrast with it. So yeah, Western intellectual imperialism. Thank you, Matthew. I left that intellectual out.
I think what you're doing is confusing how someone communicates truth with the question of, is what they're communicating true? I understand that the author of Genesis could be communicating something polemically. If the author says that God creates light before the sun, that could be a polemic against Egypt's god Ra, the sun god, saying that God made the light in the sky without the God that they think is responsible for that light. Cool story. The question still remains, is it true that the God of Israel did anything at all? Communicating that idea polemically is one thing. Proving the truthfulness of that claim is a different story. Once you remove literalism, you now have no way to verify what you're saying. It's at that point that you realize you're taking these things solely on faith, with no corroboration from the physical world. Who does that? Not me. The Bible even instructs us that the empirical evidence from the natural world should point us in God's direction. Only problem is, they didn't have the evidence that we have today. So when they looked at the physical world, their religious leaders could say things about God's activity that no one could verify. Today we can fact check those things. This idea of Western intellectual imperialism is not a good critique of what's going on here, because by the time the New Testament is written, Israel is not ancient Israel anymore. They've gone through exile where they've encountered the Persians. The Persians were conquered by the Greeks. The Persians encountered the Greeks. Greek thought and philosophy permeated the known world. So by the time Judaism comes on the scene, Israel is much more Western than many of us think. And by the time the New Testament is written, it's even more Western in its concepts, worldview, and mythology. So when the writers of the New Testament, Peter or Paul, or the people who put the words in Jesus' mouth, when they look back at the Old Testament, was Adam and Eve a polemic? Or were they real historical people? Was Noah just a polemic? Or was he a real historical person? So don't blame me for bringing a Western approach to the Old Testament. The New Testament authors did it first. I'm a product of the New Testament.
The most difficult part of this whole question is not the Old Testament material. It's the New Testament material. It's the statements of Jesus himself about Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, and this primeval history.
if you think about it like this, if you can understand that concept, what Brady Godwin is doing is he's taking our modern ways of understanding how information should be communicated. He's taking our modern ways of thinking about how one analyzes and determines whether or not someone is telling truth. And then he's transporting that into the ancient world when these literatures were written.
No, I'm saying that if this is what they were doing, and first of all, that's debatable. Viewing Genesis 1 as polemic is not a stopgap for all the theological issues in that text. Many scholars will argue that Genesis 1 cannot be purely polemic. They draw attention to the fact that not everything in Genesis 1 was a god in Egypt. Not every beast of the field was an Egyptian god. Not every creature in the sea was an Egyptian god. The text does not put mankind at the pinnacle of creation over everything that the Egyptians used to exalt. Man is not over the sun and the moon. The sun and the moon are actually rulers over the day. Man is not over the sea. Man has dominion over the creatures of the field, the birds of the air, and the creatures in the sea. You could see Genesis 1 as polemic, but there are other aspects of the text that don't fit that motif. Many scholars will talk about the way that these texts were received in ancient Israel. It was not simply polemic. They did receive these texts as truth, as our God did these things, literally. And I cite scholars who advocate this view in my book. Like them, many people today were won to Christian faith by coming to understand that the God of the Bible is the God of creation, and it is the details in that creation story that won their allegiance. Only a God who was there would be able to tell us how it happened. I wasn't there. You weren't there. I don't know what was made first, second, third, and fourth. So whoever was there should be able to speak to that accurately. It's God's ability to not just do those things, because of course a God can do them, but to speak about it confidently, authoritatively, and say, this is what I did, and be accurate. That's what won the allegiance of many people. So to come to understand, oh wait, so you mean this is not accurate? Whether he intended to be or not, this is not telling us what really happened in the beginning? Okay, so then how do I know that the one I'm trusting is the one who did this? If I find a wallet and I say, hey, I found this wallet, if it's yours, come claim it. And you come to me and say, oh yeah, that's mine. And I say, oh, what color was it? How does it open? What was in it? If you can tell me accurately the color and the fact that it snaps instead of zips, and I have every reason to trust, oh, this is your wallet. But if you don't know the details, I have no reason to believe that this is yours. That's how the Bible's creation stories worked for much of human history. Once you begin to say, oh no, it's something different, okay, that's fine. That's how they communicated truth, by speaking polemically? Cool. What reason do we have to trust it? How do I know that this is not just ancient men speaking?
And while this may seem like a lot of information, I think it's significant, along with my early comments where I referenced truth and tradition and that gap between the academy and churches.
After all that, taking me out of context, misrepresenting me, and basically lying on me, Apologists and Discredit actually comes around to a more Christian version of some of the same ideas I was driving at in my book.
You know, one thing to consider is that ancient Near Eastern studies is a very young field. It's really only about 200 years old. For most of history, the languages of the Old Testament were lost languages. It wasn't until the close of the 17th century, when Napoleon went to conquer Egypt, that he discovered the Rosetta Stone. As they continued to study it, they were able to transcribe both the Greek and some of the Coptic. And once they realized that both were saying the same thing, it helped them to translate the rest of the Greek and the Coptic and to unlock the hieroglyphics, which was a lost ancient language. And because the Egyptians interacted with all of these other people groups in the ancient world and had similar stories to these other people groups, it was ultimately the key to unlocking a lot of lost languages from the ancient world, from the ancient Near East. It's been about 100 years unlocking a bunch of lost languages, creating vocabularies, so that they were able to then start to comb the libraries, comb the museums of the world, and start to get all of these artifacts that they had dug up out of the ground that they knew were ancient. They knew based on their location, they had some idea of what people group that they were from, but they had no idea of what these things said. So you got to think, for the next 100 years, you have people going to get their PhD in translating these things, basically piecing together the ancient Near Eastern world so that today we can have a whole field of ancient Near Eastern studies.
I hope you can appreciate what he just shared. When I first learned these things, it meant a great deal to me. But it troubled me for reasons that he's about to share. Now, he doesn't seem to be troubled by it. However, I am.
This is another significant point. Prior to all of this happening, you got 1800 years of church history where traditions are curing on ideas about Genesis chapter 1, ideas about all of the Old Testament, which was written in this ancient Near Eastern context. And so now you got the tension between what traditions cured or what Christians believe these things were actually saying, being confronted with what academia, because of this new field of ancient Near Eastern studies, was revealing. And so now a lot of the traditions have to be rethought. We have to rethink some of these things and figure out what's actually going on. Like, they didn't know that everything in Genesis chapter 1 was an Egyptian god.
Now think about that. He said 1800 years before we begin to find out what ancient Near Eastern literature actually said in context. You know who's included in that? The early church, the gospel writers. In that 1800 years, you have a history of people looking at the Old Testament documents a certain way, looking at Genesis a certain way, and seeing it as, in some way, shape, or form, literal. You mean to tell me that an all-wise, all-powerful God doled out his truth in traditions that were incorrect, such that, let's say 500 years ago, someone who could not get with the tradition because maybe they just said, just don't seem like this could actually be true. They were 500 years ahead of the time. That now we're discovering, oh, you mean it wasn't literal? Oh, cool, let's switch that. But 500 years ago, somebody said, yeah, I don't think that's really true. That can't be true. But that was the tradition at the time. You mean to tell me that because they couldn't get with the tradition, they didn't believe, and because they didn't believe, they're now eternally judged? But now we know a little bit better, so now we don't teach those traditions anymore? Maybe 100 years from now, we'll get even more information and we'll have new traditions so that the people who believe like we believe today, they might believe different 100 years from now. But what about people like me today who say, dang, this don't seem like this is really accurate or true? Is there grace for people like me who can't get with the tradition because we don't think the tradition is true? Is this what an all-wise, all-powerful God is doing in terms of bringing people to the truth through traditions? And I know the answer is going to be, yeah, but none of these traditions affect the core of the gospel. How do you know that's not just your tradition, that's true? What if 100 years from now we find out that, hey, the New Testament worked just like the Old Testament did in terms of it wasn't wooden literal, it was more figurative, it was just a polemic, it was all these things that we're willing to say now because we know that we can't literally believe these things. A, because of science, and B, because of how ancient Near Eastern literature worked.
There is that distinction between, academia and theology or the church, or where people are actually putting these things into practice. And we have to have some humility in that.
Ironically, this is the very thing I called for in the preface to my book.
Not a single believer needs to lose his or her faith in the Bible for this project to be successful in my eyes. All that needs to occur is for Christian evangelists, apologists, and believers in general to begin to exercise greater humility and more compassion toward non-believers, and acknowledge that unbelief need not be the product of an evil heart or twisted will, as the book of Hebrews suggests. For some people, unbelief is simply a reasonable conclusion of a careful consideration of the evidence as we have it.
I didn't hear about the divine council. I mean, divine council for me is like 5 years old. I was exposed to it. And like any person who had a very strong white knuckles grip on his tradition, it was hard for me to process that and to think about that and to consider it, because I had been told something completely different for so long. We're unlocking the world of the Bible. We understand more about the contextual world of the two periods that the majority of the scriptures were written in now. As we continue to learn, we're going to continue to be confronted with new understandings of these things, and that we're going to have to figure out how to fit into our various traditions.
And no one should be afraid of any of that.
That's some bull. How do you preach when for 1800 years this supposed God had a good portion of his church going around the world saying things that were not true? Does this seem like what you'd expect from divine revelation? Or does it seem like the imaginings of people who were landlocked because these stories are man-made?
That was what I was saying.
Because man, when I started really diving deep into these cultural contexts, it made the Bible that much more powerful because it's filling in the gaps for me. I now get the punchlines that was being said because again, it's written from a high context perspective. I wasn't there, you know. I'm trying to air hustle into conversations, and I don't know the inside jokes. I'm starting to now, and man, they're funny.
I had a similar reaction.
I think I understand it now better than I ever have. And I don't believe it, but I understand it.
And I cry just as much as I laugh because I know the lives that have been spent on these traditions.
Quick question I got for you. If Brady would have brought in the differences of these creation accounts, could he still make the argument that he makes in this book?
No, and not at all.
Agree to disagree. The differences don't change my critique or answer my challenges. The similarities are mythical. We have no way of knowing if there are any truth to any of these accounts.
You know, you're smart enough to consider the implications of them. I think you're smart enough to consider how they influence your conclusion. So his position, his position is really his beef, as I said earlier, is really with his tradition.
Please tell me, what tradition do you suggest I go to? And how do you know that this new tradition is truth? How do I know that the next tradition that I end up in won't lead me to being disenchanted again in 30 years? I've got one life to live that I know of. You want me to spend 30 more years of my life possibly being wrong and going around spreading this to other people, standing on stages, preaching about it? You can have that.
Instead of looking into other traditions and considering maybe my tradition is the wrong tradition, he just threw Christianity out. He threw the baby out with the bathwater. And if that's what you want to do, if you want to turn your back on God, that's your business. But to try to convince others to do it, like, what's your motivation? Like, if you're like, what is so
and to convince by withholding information,
right? You're right. So and again, so and to convince by just not telling the whole truth, you know. But I want to know what his motivation is for convincing others. Because if there is no God, what makes telling others that there's no God a virtue? Like, why are you motivated? Is this a money grab?
It's at this point that I wish I had hands full of middle fingers. I would be waving at y'all like this. First of all, I walked away from several bags because I could no longer teach at Christian institutions knowing that I didn't believe this anymore. Second, it's very offensive, and I get it because I used to be this way. But for Christians and theists to think that because someone doesn't share your overarching reason, that they can't have a reason for doing something that they consider virtuous. But for those who are genuinely concerned with my motives, we live in a world that is being torn apart by all kinds of things. One of the major divisions in our world is religion, and it is a needless division. I want to see that undone. In the same way that I traveled the world preaching what I preached because I believed it was true and I thought it was freeing, I know the freedom of no longer having to try to reconcile the Bible as the Word of God when it keeps showing itself to be the word of men. I know the freedom of getting my mind and my sanity back so that I'm no longer dueling with the voices in my head, my voice, and then a million Bible passages from men I've never met, many of them contradicting each other and driving me crazy trying to figure out how to streamline their thoughts. You call it what you want. It's compassion that drove me to write this book and not just keep it to myself. And those who've gone through this experience know exactly what I'm talking about. I'll close this section by simply saying people are lining up to discredit me or my book. They're fighting to maintain something. Many of them are not being fair or honest. They have something to protect. Their pride, their dignity, their reputation, their careers, their following, their friends. I get it. I'm not fighting. I'm here for the discussion so long as there's openness, honesty, and humility. And I hope that rather than letting other people tell you what my book says, that you read it for yourself and make up your own mind. Does the Bible tell the truth about our creation, fall, and redemption?